What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Graven, a boomer shooter harkening back to the days of Doom, Heretic, or Hexen. Though before we dive fully into that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below that will discuss everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public as well. That said, there's a few achievements I need to mention for this one, because they are bugged. There are two that I could not get, Illumined Sky and Clerical Error. These involve interacting with enemies in certain ways, and despite doing exactly what it says, those achievements don't seem to be working, though it's possible the day one patch will fix it. Now, another one I want to mention, though, is an achievement called the Parallel Path for discovering all the upgrade shrines in the game. While it says you need to find all of them, that achievement actually pops after the first one, so there's some things to keep in mind. Everything else seemed to be working, though. Certainly not the first time it's come up, and I'm sure it won't be the last, though it is not worth delaying this review for. Moving right along, let's talk about what Graven is. Now, as I mentioned, it is a boomer shooter. Think the original Doom games, Hexen, Heretic. I believe the game is intended to be a spiritual successor of Hexen in particular, but all of those games kind of used the same engine. Now, what that entails, gameplay-wise, is of course going around engaging with enemies, using all sorts of weapons, managing your resources, while also dealing with various environmental puzzles, finding secrets along the way, and even completing some side quests, as this game takes us along 3 different chapters, each with their own theme and areas to discover. So with that said, let's talk about the difficulty of the game first. Now, an interesting note about this is that the health and damage of enemies does not change based on any difficulty. The difference between casual through flagellant is that the number of enemies you're facing alongside how they are spawned will change, in addition to how many resources are available to you. So on the max difficulty, you'll face different combinations of enemies as you go, with stronger enemies appearing sooner, and sometimes even in places that would normally be safe. In addition to that, you're going to have a hard time nailing down resources, such as ammunition for your various weapons. It's more about knowing how the game works and where to find certain things than it is about enemies getting even stronger. Now, on the flip side of that, this also means that even on the lowest difficulty, things like damage numbers don't change. And given that certain enemies can kill you in just a couple of hits, does require a certain amount of skill on your part to avoid those situations. So I wouldn't consider it the most difficult game by any means, especially when we get to the combat section and start talking about how death works, but certainly something to keep in mind. Moving on from there, though, let's talk about the story setup of Graven. We play as a set character, an exiled priest from the orthogonal order. Specifically, we were exiled and sentenced to death for a crime we committed in defense of another. Specifically, our adopted daughter was about to be murdered, and we killed her attacker. And despite having our sentence carried out, that is to say we were dead in the desert somewhere, we suddenly find ourselves awake and on a small boat headed to the town of Cruxforth, which is dealing with a curse of sorts that a voice at the beginning tells us it is our job to solve because we must earn our peace. Following this, over the course of 3 different chapters, you'll be engaging with all sorts of enemies, multiple different cults that oppose the orthogonal order, and are generally killing and maiming everyone that they see, and as you are a good priest at the end of the day, you are trying to put an end to that. Overall, I would consider the story pretty solid. I enjoyed it well enough. While you'll be dealing with monsters and sort of general horrors right out of the gate, towards the end of the game it starts to take a more eldritch tone, with you facing horrors from the stars, potentially, as opposed to your more standard fare of undead. A lot of that comes down to how much of the notes that you're reading, though, as it's pretty easy to skip right by that stuff if you want to, but a lot of the story and background is told through notes you can find, and it's relatively easy to play through the game without really engaging with the story much at all, so while I enjoyed it well enough, I could also see someone going through this game and not really having any idea of what is really going on, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. I enjoyed it personally, though. From there, let's talk progression systems. There are a few different ones to mention, but it mostly boils down to weapons, upgrading those weapons, and your shrines. Now, you're not going to start the game with all the weapons available to you, but rather you have to find them. A few of them are very much so missable, though quite a few will also be put directly on the main path, and finding these weapons, of course, gives you access to their unique playstyles, and these include things like melee weapons, gun types with a fantasy skin. For instance, we can get a fletchant, which is effectively a shotgun, albeit with arrows, We also get a couple of items later, such as a spell book if you find it, or the crystal candelabra, which both act as sort of automatic weapons almost, that feed off of your mana or their ammo type instead. So you'll be picking those up, but you're not done when you find the weapon, because after you find them, you can go back to town, find a certain vendor, there's usually 2, and at the cost of some gold, you can then upgrade these weapons, giving them new and unique effects. A lot of times, this comes in the form of an alternative fire mode, increasing the capabilities available to you. Many of them actually do pretty useful things, like the crystal candelabra gets an alternative fire mode that actually destroys projectiles midair. And then things like the Fletchant get an alternative fire mode that allows them to turn their ammunition into sort of sticky grenades where they'll stick into a target before a short delay and then blowing up. Now, unfortunately, I do think they overused that specific mechanic a little bit. There's like 3 different weapons that have essentially the same alternative fire mode. But nonetheless, that's how it works. Now, the other big part of progression, outside of just generally finding items like rings or spells, as well as those will be available to you, we then have our orthogonal shrines. These are shrines you can activate upon finding them, and doing so will grant you a small permanent bonus to either your health, stamina, magicka, or all 3. There's quite a few of these shrines. The bonuses themselves are relatively incremental, but it is going to, of course, let you live longer, use your mana for longer, or use your stamina for longer, which is used when you are sprinting, jumping, or attacking with melee weapons. Probably the most important thing to note for a lot of the progression, though, is that a decent amount of it is hidden or locked behind exploration in some way. For instance, some early game areas you can't get into until you've been to the later hubs that give you items that allow you to traverse those things. And then doubling back will allow you to enter, of course, and find resources like gold or new items like weapons, which is especially important for your spell upgrades, as those are upgraded just like any other weapon. But in order to do so, your spells require a special resource called Eldritch Quills, and they are much more sparse than gold. Moving right along, though, let's talk about the gameplay and the world, which will naturally kind of bleed into combat a little bit, as they are all kind of one and the same in a game like this. As I mentioned earlier, the game itself is divided up into 3 chapters or hubs, and initially you'll go through those in a pretty linear manner. However, after you beat the story, you can get access to a fast travel point in the hub that will allow you to go back to the previous 2. This makes it relatively easy to wrap up anything you missed, and what's interesting is doing this will actually respawn things like bosses, etc. So if there's a specific thing you want to fight or track down, this is a viable way to see those things at your leisure. Now, in terms of moving through these areas, it is down to your central hub, which is where your vendors are, and then the game's surrounding areas where you'll be exploring, opening up paths, opening up shortcuts, and of course fighting off all of these enemies while at the same time solving environmental puzzles or simply looking for secrets. Now, generally speaking, from a level design standpoint, you have to tackle 1 or maybe 2 at most different areas first before you can then access the later part of that particular zone. To give an example, right in the first one, Cruxforth, you have to go through an area called the Lice Slough to take care of your first mission before you get led into the city, which then opens up the next area called the Brine Muskeg. You have to go through that area before you get access to the next area called the Clotted Avenues, for instance, and then it opens up a little more from there. So there is, despite it being a relatively open zone, a definitive path through that particular hub or chapter. All of those individual areas will usually give way to various shortcuts, many of which will direct you back to the hub, giving you a way to quickly traverse to the new areas and back to town. Now, ironically, I do think that little bit of design could have used a bit of extra polish, or honestly just something like a town portal. Because as it stands, sometimes when you're moving through an area, you'd like to get back to town quickly, but it can be a pain to do so because you cannot simply fast travel there in some way, which means you have to traverse through all this ground and territory, which sometimes involves going through a very specific route, or you could just quit to the main menu, load your game back up, as there's only 1 save file per playthrough, at which point you'll be spawned back into town anyway. And while truth be told, that is actually pretty useful for the rare occasion where you might get stuck, which is possible occasionally through environmental interactions, as you can pick up and move a lot of the scenery, such as barrels, items, etc., most of which are also destructible, but you can also stack them and then use them to climb and get over things that you maybe shouldn't be doing. And given how relatively freeform the game is with dying anyway, as you just respawn with some lost gold in most cases, I think an out-of-combat town portal would have done this game a lot of good. because frankly, moving through some of these areas is a little more tedious than I think it really needs to be, especially once you've unlocked the shortcuts. So even something like a small, say, waypoint system, I think would have gone a long way here to alleviate some of the annoyance. But in terms of the actual individual levels or areas that you can explore, most of that is well done. There's quite a few secrets hidden in there. A lot of them are fun to move through and figure out, though this does involve a lot of puzzle solving, and for the most part I think those are well done, as long as you're reading notes and paying attention to where you are and what it is you need to find, etc. I think most people will be okay, but there is certainly some room here for improvement. There were a couple of places I got stuck for a couple hours trying to figure out how to move forward, as the game was quite unintuitive about how to do so. One of which is down to a bug that happened, and the other one was just a puzzle I got stuck on for several hours, as the solution I ultimately found and discovered was not really communicated anywhere, which was opening up the gates and operating the machinery to access an area called Grimwine's estate. So if anybody has trouble solving that puzzle, let me know in the comments and I'll help sort you out. But the quest bug was probably more severe overall, because this situation came about as a result of a quest updating before it really should have, specifically before I got an item that would have allowed me to move forward. So in simple terms, I got a quest update that was telling me to move to a new area before I got an item that would actually allow me to move to that new area, which caused some confusion on my end and ultimately wound up with me just kind of wandering around until I happened to find what I needed, where it suddenly became clear what happened. So there are certainly some areas where I think the game could have done a better job of communicating the way forward. Outside of that though, it must be said that all 3 hub areas and chapters are incredibly atmospheric. One thing I enjoy probably the most about this game is how much just simultaneous dread and curiosity it manages to instill in the player, or at the very least me. The first act is incredibly dreary. There's all sorts of undead around, there's a plague, dead bodies everywhere. Usual stuff, maybe a little on the nose, but even in that regard, they managed to really nail what that section was all about. And then in subsequent areas, such as the snow area or the sand-swept city, they do a great job of conveying the sense of space and exploration. And I think that does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of encouraging the player to continue to explore and find solutions to things that might not be obvious otherwise. Like, for instance, using your magic spells in ways that you might not initially think of. In Act 2, for instance, you can find a couple of spots where you can use your fire spell to light fuses on fire that then go on to light up explosive barrels that clear the path forward, which is a slight twist on the way you've been using that fire spell up to that point, which usually helps you light things on fire and destroy scenery, of course. Another example is when you get the frost spell, which means you've acquired the lightning spell by that point, and where normally you can use the lightning spell to operate certain gears, and thus do things like raise gates on a timer in some instances, you can then use the frost spell to actually freeze those gears so those things stay in the open position for longer. And that's the way some of these mechanics interact a little bit, and there's even more stuff than that to discover, especially once you start upgrading things. And combined with the ability to actually move items around and interact with those and create unique solutions to problems, I think you've got a gameplay and world that is a lot of fun to interact with, even outside of just mowing down enemies. Now, when it comes to mowing down enemies, combat is a huge portion of this game, as the genre is called a boomer shooter after all. So while most of what we will be doing is pumping enemies full of ammunition of one sort or another, or unleashing our magical abilities, this does come down to a few specific things, mainly managing your resources. Depending on the difficulty, this may or may not be a big deal, but using your ammunition appropriately is important, which means using it against the appropriate enemy types. Enemies themselves have weaknesses to certain types of weapons or elemental effects, on top of specific weak points in some cases. This is going to allow you to maximize your damage, of course, which means minimizing your lost ammunition, which plays a big part in the higher difficulties if you don't want to die a lot. Another thing you'll have to manage is your stamina, however. Running costs a general amount of stamina, usually not very much by itself. However, once you start running and jumping, or running and swinging your melee weapon, you'll burn through stamina pretty quick. but running and jumping are, I would say, the primary causes of it. However, if you are using one of the melee weapons, you need to be aware that swinging that does cost stamina, and the lower your stamina gets, it actually increases, meaning you'll run out of it faster. So melee weapons, while useful against certain enemies and not bound by an ammo limitation, do have that limitation based on stamina. But I also want to speak a little bit about the magic available to you. You'll ultimately get 3 spells and a few different magical weapons. The 3 spells, Fire, Lightning, and Frost, can be upgraded from their initial, more or less environmental only effects, such as lighting things on fire, freezing them, or of course turning gears with lightning, a few upgrades later and they can do some sizable damage to enemies as well. There are also a few different magical weapons that eat your mana to deal damage, such as the Orthogonal Hymn, which is a spellbook essentially you can get. So interestingly enough, magic plays both a part in actual combat and also interacting with the environment in various ways, which I think is a nice touch. Now weapon-wise, it's pretty much what you would expect. You have fantasy versions of more typical guns you would find in shooters, like the shotgun that I mentioned earlier is technically a fletchant. Here, the Crystal Candelabra can act as an automatic weapon, so can the Orthogonal Hymn, and upgrading these gives you access to alt-fire modes that deal damage with a special effect in some way. And importantly, they all use different ammo types, so you're going to want to alternate them, and a lot of that comes down to utilizing your action bar, which you'll have seen on screen up to this point, as you cannot quickly swap between weapons unless they are on your action bar. Although you can open up your inventory mid-combat and swap them out, which seems like an unnecessary restriction to me, but it is what it is. And while that covers pretty much the basics, where combat gets much more interesting is how enemies are spawned at you, as they will come in combinations, and each of them has their own different abilities. For instance, in Act 1, you get the Skitterflies, who shoot poison down at you, typically while you're being assailed by the zombie or skeleton enemies, before running into the larger, more deadly enemies later in the act, such as the Maya Reavers with a devastating hit, or the Undecaying Cult members who will throw potion bombs at you, and you need to fend all of those guys off simultaneously in many cases. So the joy of combat is figuring out how a lot of that stuff weaves together and how to do it effectively while conserving your resources. But the big showpieces are of course the bosses. There is one at the end of each act and a couple of others, and many of these guys are quite cool. They usually involve a big arena that is traditional for, I would say, a boomer shooter, where you can pick up all sorts of items and things as you throw basically everything you've got at these monstrosities, who, if they catch you, will likely kill you very, very quickly, which is where the armor system comes in. While a lot of enemies can kill you quite easily, you can find various armor to, of course, augment your health with and keep you alive that much longer, giving you just one more thing to juggle while you're bouncing around in between combat sessions. So I would say for the most part, if you like the combat of things like Doom or any other boomer shooter, most recently with, I would say, Bolt Gun, you'll probably enjoy what's on offer here. But I will say there is one caveat, and that is that there's not really much of a fail state for this game. You see, when you die, you just respawn with a lost amount of gold based on how much gold you have and the difficulty you have it set on. Once you run out of gold, it starts eating into your available health on respawn, but you'll always respawn. So it is very much so possible to sort of just death zerg certain areas if you're having trouble, or if it's just expeditious to do so. And while you will lose gold doing this, which you need to upgrade your weapons, etc., depending on your situation, or if you make the call to upgrade your weapons before a big fight, and thus you don't have a lot of gold to worry about losing anyway, maybe that's not such a big deal to you. So I do think the game could stand to be a little more punishing in its difficulty, especially on the higher stages, as the penalty for death is non-existent. And I'm sure some people will enjoy that, but considering that a lot of enemies don't respawn or even regain their health upon those deaths, once you've figured the game out, that does sort of take the challenge out of it. Though that does finally bring us to our Steam Deck section. Now, on the Steam Deck, its official rating is unsupported, but I think that might have just been for the earlier period of early access that this game was in, as I was able to play it on the Steam Deck and it ran quite well. I didn't capture any footage for it because it was giving me some trouble, but gameplay-wise it was fine. It occasionally stuttered a little bit as the game was loading here and there, but I would say the main issue you're probably going to have with this on Steam Deck is that it does not have full controller support, meaning that the icons you see will always be for a keyboard. And while the game does have controller support, that is just kind of baked into the game, you won't get updated prompts or anything like that, so it can take some fiddling around with the controls to get comfortable with what you're doing. And the UI itself is clearly not set up for a screen as small as the Steam Deck in mind, as a lot of it becomes incredibly small and hard to read on that screen. And that's to say nothing of the fact that games that require a decent amount of precise aiming are difficult to play on a bit of hardware like that, especially seeing as this doesn't have any form of controller aim assist. So long story short, while you absolutely can play this on the Steam Deck, it's not a, I would say, amazing experience for it, as it currently lacks some features to make that less of a headache. Though that does bring us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this up. On the positive side of things, I love Graven's atmosphere, its sense of exploration, how they weaved in all the environmental puzzles, and it's a game that does a good job of pulling you in and making you want to play more, at least for my money. Combined with that, a decent combat system, and the core of what Graven is trying to do is quite a bit of fun. But we of course do have some negatives, and for me it was just the unintuitive parts of the game. There's just little things I think could be done better, like a waypoint system or a town portal, for instance, to deal with that, because reality is you can just quit to the main menu and jump right back to town anyway, so why not just implement that? There's stuff like the alternative fire modes for the weapons overlapping way too much. A lot of those do the same thing, and there's just little things every here and there that you're constantly tripping over that I think could have been smoothed out a little more, especially for a game that spent a lot of time in early access. And all of that draws me to my conclusion. Graven can be certainly a lot of fun with a lot of fun gameplay elements, combat you can get really into, but I do think it falls short of being a great experience in a few different places that, if they managed to get ironed out, would elevate it to a better place than it is. But ultimately, this is a small game available for $25 at the moment. I don't believe that price is going up either. And for that price, I think you can have a pretty good time with a playthrough running about, I would say, 12 to 15 hours depending on the person. And at that price, I think you're likely to get your money's worth. That is pretty much going to wrap it up for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. Let me know what you think about Graven down in the comment section below. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.